up until the time where New York State shut us down into quarantine, he was still at work every day, 8 hours, 5 days a week. Although he was 80, and I'm sure everyone in their head's picturing, an older gentleman with a cane or slouched over, he was more like a 60-year-old. He was very active, loving guy, loved his family, loved being with, his 4 children and his many grandchildren, and when they visited, and just speaking and laughing and having a great time. And like I said, I lost more than my father that day.
Joanne, your father, Anthony, tell us about him.
Sure. Well, unlike Scott's dad, my dad had many medical issues. He also suffered from depression, anxiety, mental illness, and more recently diagnosed a few years back with dementia and Parkinson's. So my dad had a lot going on, but he was still an 86-year-old in stable life. Growing up, my dad was a epitome, but he was just the strength in our family. My father was the one who was always there to rush us to the ER when we needed to get stitches when we were kids, defend us, take us to school, deal with the situations in a very matter-of-factly way. My father was a man with very few words, but when he did speak, he spoke matter-of-factly, and he was heard. But then after he divorced my mother when I was 17, he declined mentally from there. They were married for 21 years, but he took it hard, and he was never the same again. So that's when the mental illness started. And over the years, me and my sister and brother had helped him as much as we could while also raising our families. Now, more recently, my dad didn't know what was going on during this whole time, although he was explained. He really didn't understand too much what was going on. And he depended on me before COVID to assist him with feeding him, making sure he was cooperative with the nurses to take his medication. So when everything shut down, I just picture every day in my head, even 6 months later, what really happened behind closed doors in those nursing homes, because patients and residents like my dad who have all these ailments and illnesses and don't understand what's going on, I can't picture the quality of care that he must have gotten under those circumstances.
Okay, Scott, and we'll come back to you in a minute, Joanne. Scott, tell us how COVID-19 entered your father's life and your life. How did that happen?
Well, it started actually months back. Right now, like I said, we're in business together with my other brother, Michael, and we deal a lot with overseas. And it really started affecting us directly, obviously not medically, when our friends in China started telling us what was going on there. And it became really apparent to us that whatever it was very real and very dangerous. Within the course of a couple of months, like I said, they shut us down as far as quarantine here in New York. And a few days later, my father just started feeling ill, just a cold. Over the course of a few days, he got much, much worse until he wound up in the hospital. And immediately upon getting to the hospital, he was put on a ventilator. I would say 5-6 days later, I started with a fever. And panicked. I went to the doctor. They put me on some medication, hoping it would help. And on March 31st, I wound up in the hospital by ambulance, not being able to breathe. I spent a few days in the hospital before winding up on a ventilator myself. And while I was on a ventilator on April 11th, while I was still on a ventilator, my father passed away. I did not find out about it for probably close to another week and a half after he passed, and I been on the ventilator during the funeral, and you never really got to see him or say goodbye, and really even pay my respects with my family. Very odd, emotional, and oddly not emotional at the same time.
What is that like to be worried about him first, and then to start to worry about yourself, and then wind up on the ventilator? And how much do you remember even of that time when you were in the hospital?
I remember getting to the emergency room. I remember being moved to a COVID unit. Bits and pieces of that I remember. I remember being taken up to the ICU and talking to the doctors about being put on a ventilator. They were holding off as long as they could because that was around the time when they had realized that putting people on a ventilator right away was not the right way to go. I worried about him as soon as he got sick. We assumed what it was based upon his symptoms and what they were telling us in the media. And on top of that, like I said, at the end of the day, he's an 80-year-old man. How much could the human body take, no less, at that age? So I was very worried about him. I will say when I got sick, I don't really think I ever worried about myself. I worried about my wife and my 3 sons, and what if something catastrophic happened to me? What was going to happen to them?
Scott, how long have you been coughing now?
This is something that was caused by being intubated for so long. It caused reflux, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it'll probably be with me for a long time.
When they told you that your dad had passed away and you had just finally come off of the ventilator, take me to that moment.
Well, I came off the ventilator, and I was hallucinating tremendously. It was probably about 5 days or 6 days. I did not know I was in the hospital. I thought I was traveling the world. I thought I was on a bus. I thought I was on a 747 with an observation deck. I thought I was on a riverboat. Crazy hallucinations. And by the time I started to become lucid, which, like I said, is 5-6 days later, I wasn't sure. And I kept calling my wife on the phone in the room and saying, "Can you please bring me my cell phone? It's boring. I want to check my mail. I want to do this." And I wound up fighting with my wife for a few days. They didn't want to give me the phone because they did not want me going on social media and finding out about my father, finding out about what happened to me and how I was saved. And they didn't think, in hindsight, they were correct. I could not have handled that physically at that point. Emotionally is another story, but my body, I still couldn't breathe. I had double pneumonia. I was on oxygen. I couldn't even get out of bed. I had no strength. I actually found out about it. I think I accidentally called my older brother, and I was like, why won't my wife give me the phone? And back and forth, and just in conversation, one thing led to another, and he told me. And
all right, Scott.
I remember Yeah,
I was going to put you on pause for a minute because I want to switch over to Joanne. And Joanne, the same question for you as we raised with Scott. There came the time, obviously, when COVID entered the life of you and your family. Do you remember how it began?
Oh, yeah. At around the end of February, beginning of March, I myself got sick. But I tested twice negative. But I had all the symptoms of COVID that I never experienced before in my life, and I knew it had to be COVID. So I was debilitated in the bed around that time, trying to get better. At the same time, I was on the phone with the nursing home, calling endlessly every single day, 2, 3, 4 times a day, to find out how my dad was doing and what plans were in place to protect him. But I never got the phone calls returned to me. I also left emails. I never got an email back, so it left me very nervous. Me and my sister were like, he was quarantined. We couldn't go there to see how he was doing. So there's no correspondence at all between the nursing home and us. And then we get that dreaded phone call, and I remember it vividly. It was, now this is weeks later, so on April 26th evening, we get a phone call, my sister does, from the nursing home telling us that our dad has a fever, and he doesn't look well and he's having trouble breathing, that they're going to send him to the emergency room. So they sent him to the emergency room. My sister calls me and lets me know that he got there, but he's refusing to take his medication that they want to give him, and he doesn't want to eat. My sister had explained to the ER doctors and nurses that her sister, is the only one who can convince him to take his medication, and maybe my sister needs to call. So that's when they said they would call me the next morning. They were obviously overwhelmed with so many patients that evening. So I prayed all night long. I said, God, please, if it's this one last time, let me see and speak to my dad. The next morning, I get the call at 9:10 a.m. This was the 28th of April, from the nurse telling me that on a FaceTime, if I can help them by probably asking my father to take the medicine they're trying to give him, which was the hydrochloroquine, which now we know wasn't a good option for people who had heart problems. And my father was a patient who had heart problems. But at the time, who knew? But anyhow, there he is on a FaceTime with me. I'm looking at my dad. He's laboring to breathe. He has an oxygen mask on. The nurse is telling him, Anthony, do you recognize your daughter? And he shook his head, yes. I tried everything in my heart, in my mind, to stay strong, not to let him see me cry, which is very hard, but I didn't. And I told my dad, just please open your mouth. The doctors and nurses are here to help you. And I explained to him how important it was to do that. And a few seconds later, he opened up his mouth. We were able to give him the medicine. Then I looked at my dad and I said, Dad, I love you. Everything's going to be okay. I'm sorry I'm not there with you, but the nurses are going to be there to help you. And I felt like a liar afterwards, because 3 hours later, I get another call from the physician on staff. They're telling me that my dad needs to be placed on a ventilator. The oxygen levels are way exceeded the amount that's needed to help him. So then at that moment, me and my sister had to make a decision really quickly, whether to have them put him on a ventilator or have him peacefully or comfortably pass away. We both agreed that, considering my dad's age and what he's been through, put him on a ventilator would be a hard thing for him. So before we even got the chance to tell the doctors what our decision was, the doctor called me back 2 minutes later to tell me my dad had passed.
Doctor, you're with us, and I want to bring you into the conversation. In listening to the stories that you've just heard Scott and Joanne tell about COVID and how it entered their lives and how it ultimately led to the deaths of each of their loved ones, as an expert on grieving, what do you hear that perhaps we, the listening audience, maybe are not picking up on?
I wouldn't have the arrogance to say that I'm hearing what others are not. I imagine anyone listening sensitively and who are willing to imagine these circumstances unfolding in their own family have plenty of empathy for getting what both Scott and Joanne are telling us. What I hear in it is both the uniformity and sameness of the circumstance and also the diversity in these two different trajectories toward loss, toward death. Of course, with Scott, it was a pretty fast decline, and in the context of a father who seemed to be 20 years younger than his age in terms of his level of activity, engagement, being a coworker, friend, very engaged. Of course, for Joanne, the backstory was different. It's one that really had been unraveling for a long time, and of course of many illnesses and mental illnesses that in some way took her father from her a bit at a time from quite early in her life. And so I think it's important to recognize that the grief can be different. In one case, it can have this sense of maybe more trauma and shock. It just doesn't fit at all with the picture as it had been. And then, of course, for Joanne, being in a position of caregiving in relation to a father who had long needed it, feeling that insufficiency of even being able to be with him at the end, and even to be engaged usefully in treatment planning at a point that it was already too late. So there's a quality of suddenness and trauma in both, especially high, I think, in Scott's case, and then a sense of insufficiency to really be there and to feel almost a fog of not knowing coming from the interactions with the care facility in which her father was located. So I hear those differences, and it reminds me that in some sense, how we grieve is a function of a few different factors. It's a function of who we are, it's a function of who we lose, and it's a function of how we lose them. Here, both of these brave souls talking to us about their very intimate experience lost the same person in terms of a role, but a very different person in terms of who that person was for them and how intact and engaged they were before the illness. And of course, they each then experienced a COVID-related death, and one that was pretty precipitous, pretty quick from the point that it was known. But I do want to acknowledge those points of difference as well as similarity as I listen to this story. And I also think that they're hinting at aspects of this that are that we often don't factor into the statistics, right? As we look at the real human dramas and the heartbreak that lie at the center of all of this, and whether it's at the level of, in some sense, as Scott is still contending with, and as he says he will for a long time, the physical impact of this illness on his own life.
Yeah, Doctor, I want to jump in here, and Scott, since you're with us here, have you had time? I mean, just based on what we were just hearing from Dr. Niemeyer, you trying to get yourself better, dealing with all this, did you actually have time to process your father's death?
I did. I'll say one thing, kind of a little off topic, but about me. I'm a retired career medic. I've been around death and destruction, and as well as good things, pretty much my entire life. And people in that field, you kind of become a little bit callous to protect yourself. I think in my case, that's also one of the things that kind of prevented me from, hitting me as hard as I thought it would, or I thought it should. But, I don't know. It's very difficult. After I was strong enough, it was probably about a month after I got home, where I was able to give up my walker and my cane. I was still on oxygen. But, my wife and kids took me to the cemetery. And at that point, it hit me.
Scott Cohen from Nassau County, New York. Scott, thank you for talking to us. Joanne Rodriguez, Yonkers, New York. Thanks to you both for telling us what you've been through.
If you are joining us, we're spending the hour going well beyond the grim 200,000 death statistic of those people in this country so far who have died because of COVID-19. We're spending a commercial-free hour hearing about the people we've lost and the loved ones they left behind.
We have Denise Kaplan from just outside Denver, Colorado now. Her husband, Scott, 43 years old, died of COVID-19 in May. Denise, the first thing that sticks out to me about that is 43 years old. That's young.
Yeah, that's right. He was a young 43-year-old and has left behind a 43-year-old wife, a 14-year-old son, an 11-year-old son, all of us who ended up sick as well.
Tell us a little bit about who he was as a person.